The Frierdicker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh was at a whole different level, and we see this illustrated in the date of Gimmel Tammuz, particularly when Gimmel Tammuz falls in the week of Parshas Chukas. Gimmel Tammuz, the Tog ven Chakmei Chadmur, is befrei geworden from Beis Hasurim. Gimmel Tammuz, the day that the Frierdicker Rebbe was freed from prison, very often is around about the time of Parshas Chukas. Amol in the Bach von Parshas Chukas, like this year, where it's in the week of Parshas Chukas. But if I'm in the Tag very mismarich von Shabbos Parshas Chukas, and sometimes in the week following the week that is blessed by Parshas Chukas. And when you consider the well-known teaching of the Shalah, that every special occasion on the Jewish calendar, whether it be a Yom Tov or a rabbinically ordained special day on the calendar, so they are always alluded to in the parashas that are around that particular date. So there must therefore be an allusion in Parashas Chukas to what Gimmel Tammuz is all about. So let's understand what happened on Gimmel Tammuz for the Frierdicker Rebbe. In the Gula von Rebbe seinen Gewinn zwei klolistische Shlovim. The liberation of the Frierdicker Rebbe was essentially in two main stages. Gimmel Tammuz is a befrei geworden from Beis Hasurim. On Gimmel Tammuz, the Frierdicker Rebbe was released from actual prison. Aber motim dann verschickt in Golus auf 3 Jahre, but with a sentence of 3 years exile. Erst noch wird Beis Gimmel Tammuz is in ganz befrei geworden. It was only 10 days later, on the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, that the Frierdicker Rebbe was completely released. And that means Euch von der Verschickung, also released from this exile, und hat sich gekennst können and could go back home. Kommt euch, in other words, as Gimmel Tammuz given the Ascholas HaGeula, that Gimmel Tammuz was the beginning of the process of that liberation. When your Gimmel Tammuz is given the Shleimus HaGeula, whereas the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, that is the conclusion, the culmination, the completion of the liberation of Frierdicker Rebbe. Time is for an Ilin Gimmel Tammuz, the Gabe Yud Beis Gimmel Tammuz, and that's why there's a certain advantage people don't realize about Gimmel Tammuz even over Yud Beis Gimmel Tammuz. The celebration of the festival of redemption is assigned to Yud Beis Gimmel Tammuz for obvious reasons. Because in order to have an open celebration, a festival, you have to have, you can only set that when the Gula is complete, which only happens when you get your Beis Gimmel Tammuz. And another example of the same thing is al derech vi birkas hagoyim, was the Rebbe hat gemacht erst noch der Gula Yud Beis Tammuz, like bench and goimel, which the Frierdicker Rebbe could only do after Yud Beis Tammuz. Because as the Alter Rebbe paskins, you cannot say hagoimel until the person has completely left the dangerous situation or recovered completely from chas v'sholom an illness. So we get it. The celebration is going to be at Yud Beis Gimmel Tammuz, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that Gimmel Tammuz has something unique that even Yud Beis Gimmel Tammuz don't have. I mean, so if we're not talking about the celebration, but we're talking about the liberation per se, there's an advantage to the beginning of the process of liberation over the completion of that process. Well, the obvious reason is because starting a process is always extremely difficult, and so therefore to begin the process of Geula obviously is a very challenging experience, and to get through that challenge, big deal. But even more than that, when the beginning of the Geula begins, that means that now you're shifting completely from one reality to an opposite reality, from a Golus reality to a Geula reality, and that is an exponential shift. But especially in the case of the Frierdicker Rebbe, the change in situation for the Frierdicker Rebbe on Gimmel Tammuz, the befreiung from Beis Hasurim, is that he got out of prison, which means, especially when you consider what prison this was, Stalinist, communist prison. And even going to a place of exile. But the fact is, going out of the prison system is given in certain respects that was a more radical shift than even the shift of going from exile back home. Especially when you consider that when the Frierdicker Rebbe went back home, he was still under surveillance and almost in a sense of house arrest by the communist regime. So from exile to being under the so-called house arrest is not as radical a change as from prison out of prison. Now we know that the beginning of any process is the seed that contains all of the detail of what will unfold through that process. Like you see, for example, the concept of acronyms, where the Gemara talks about how you can find no trikun in Torah, that it's actually a Jewish thing, like the word anoichi, for example, in Aser Sadibris. As the erste Ois von a Wort is Ramesef dem ganzen Wort. The first letter of a word represents the whole word, and that's why it was typical in times of the Beis Hamikdash they'd just put a mem, and that would represent Meiser, etc. But der ze beinyonenas, the ganze Gula von Rebbe is given nirmas and kolon der Scholas Gula von Gimmel Tammuz. And not only is the beginning of the liberation on Gimmel Tammuz such a radical movement from imprisonment to some degree of freedom, but it also incorporates within it everything that this Gula was all about. So let's understand, what is the story of the imprisonment and liberation of the Frierdicker Rebbe? The Techen Klode von der Meise Gula von Rebbe ist doch verbunden mit seiner Avodah von Abbas Torah v'achzokas hayadus v'afatzosam im medinahi. The whole reason the Frierdicker Rebbe was arrested and the miracle of his release was all tied to his efforts to spread Yiddishkeit and to strengthen Torah in that very difficult country. In order to do that in that country at that time required literal Mesiras Nefesh. And that's going to be the key that we're going to focus on over here, is the Frierdicker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh. The Rebbe is discussed previously more than once. This wasn't regular Mesiras Nefesh, where a person is threatened to give up their Judaism or Chas v'Shalom. Now, Mesiras Nefesh, this was a Mesiras Nefesh with no limits and with no considerations. Had anybody done a rational assessment of whether or not this avoida, this shlichus, could work in Russia, they would have had no reason to continue, because the odds were stacked vastly against them. And you for sure would not risk your life for something that has so little chance of success. And for sure, logically, it would not have made sense for the Frierdicker Rebbe to endanger the lives of his students and his shluchim for something that didn't seem to have any prospects of success. On the Moifen from Mesiras Nefesh ken cheshbonos hat man gesehen begoli beim Rebbe in sein Eibende Montanhoge bechlal. Now, this concept of having Mesiras Nefesh without any considerations, without any limits, you saw the Frierdicker Rebbe model this. Aber Frat bekeshet zu sein Gula begimmel Tammuz, and one of the key places where he models this absolute dedication to the point of Mesiras Nefesh that is completely irrational was in Gimmel Tammuz. In fact, the fact that the beginning of the liberation is tied to the date Gimmel Tammuz is testimony to the Frierdicker Rebbe's dedication and Mesiras Nefesh. And we'll explain how. Shlomo, as das, was die Gula von Gimmel Tammuz ist gewesen, verbunden mit der Tage von Mesiras Nefesh. The fact that what occurred on Gimmel Tammuz, the degree of liberation of the Frierdicker Rebbe on Gimmel Tammuz, is tied not just to Mesiras Nefesh, but this level of Mesiras Nefesh, on keine Agbolos von Cheshbon, without any consideration for what is rational, is weil in der Scholle von der Gula hat sich gedacht, ausdrücken der Teichen Kloli von der Meise Gula, well, as we've mentioned, because the beginning of the process must capture the essence of what the process is all about. And so the Frierdicker Rebbe being liberated from Russian authority, that had to be included and expressed in the most prominent way in Gimmel Tammuz itself. So what happened on Gimmel Tammuz that's so radical? The Rebbe Bala Gula v'Asimcha erzählt, the Frierdicker Rebbe himself tells the story, as Donnerstag Rosh Chodesh Tammuz from Mittag, hat man ihm angesagt, die Idee has man lost him arois from Beis Asurim. It was before noon on Thursday, which was Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. They told him they're going to release him, and verschickt him auf 3 Jahre Golus in der Stadt Kastamar. And they were going to send it to Kastamar for 3 years of exile. Thereby, and at the same time they let him know, as then in the morning they'll let him go. Man hat ihm geleibt zu verbringen 6 Stunden mit seinen Bnei Bayis, und ihm auch gesagt, dass bei Nacht wird verlassen die Stadt und fahren kein Customer. So basically they told him, Thursday you'll go, you'll visit your family, you'll spend 6 hours, and then in the evening you're going to go on your way to Customer. So it's Thursday when he's given this information. This is how the day is going to go. At the Rebbe gefragt, the Rebbe asked an obvious question: when is he going to reach Customer? They told him he'll reach there on Shabbos itself. So the Frierdicker Rebbe said there is no way he's going to travel on Shabbos. Und noch der spezielle Status in die Kreisen von der Mashallah, and so it took a tremendous amount of effort, actually at the highest echelons of the government. They postponed the Frierdicker Rebbe's journey. So instead of leaving the prison on Thursday, he left on Sunday, which was Gimmel Tammuz, and in the interim he stayed in prison. Now, einer von die, was haben voll durchgeführt im Arrest von Rebbe, gesagt dem Rebbe, so one of the people who was involved in the process of arresting the Frierdicker Rebbe said to the Frierdicker Rebbe at that point, if he refuses to travel Thursday night and to allow himself to get to the exile city Kastamar on Shabbos, they're not going to let him out of prison at all. In other words, this is your chance to get out, take it or leave it. At the Rebbe Genfert, the Frierdicker Rebbe was unshaken and responded, as is great to bleiben in Tumah, wie viel soll nicht sein, he'll remain in prison as long as necessary, but there's no way he's traveling on Shabbos. Now you can see the Frierdicker Rebbe's strength of and his conviction. Question is it a rational position, even halachically? So we need to understand why the Frierdicker Rebbe conducted himself this way, to dig his heels in to say, I'm not traveling on Shabbos in these circumstances. Because the fact that he rejected their instruction to leave immediately for Kastamar, the fact that they're allowing him out of prison, he should have leapt at the opportunity. And instead of bleiben in Tumah, he chose not to take it and to stay in prison. That means that the Frierdicker Rebbe immediately put himself in a position of mortal danger. Staying in prison is mortal danger. Who knows if you survive the day in prison, in those prisons. We know that the original ruling on the Frierdicker Rebbe was Chas v'Shalom, the worst of the worst. Now, durch Stadlos hat man die Gesetze erwartet gewähnt, und es verbieten auf dem leichten Neunisch von 10 Jahren oder nach 3 Jahren in Golus, and then after a tremendous amount of international pressure, they were able to downgrade that instead of Chas v'Shalom, they'd send him to exile originally for 10 and then later for 3 years to Kastamar. Und nachdem, aber die Woche haben nach Tchila herausgegeben und dem gesagt, den Horischen, Hanal sei der nicht gebeten. Now bear in mind that those who ruled originally that the Frierdicker Rebbe should have the worst punishment, they didn't change their tune, they didn't change their attitude. The only thing is, man hat sich gezwungen, von der Hecher Memschele kreisen, als bleiben die Gatfit, wird Tafkidum, wird Tag vom, sollen selber mit Vater sein, dem Prater Urteil und befreien dem Rebbe von Turme. They had pressure that came from the government that they had to conform to, which is release the Frierdicker Rebbe from prison and send him off to Kastamar. But from their part, they were willing to do much more heinous things. And the truth of the matter is, inside their prison system, they could have gotten away with it. It's doch moving. As we say, is sein bleiben beschussen in Turme given Sakodan Sefoshes Mamash. So there's no question for the Frierdicker Rebbe to remain in their clutches, in their prison system, was literal danger to life. Aber fragt, als das Gufo, was der Rebbe hat sich abgesagt zu fahren am Shabbos, especially when the Frierdicker Rebbe rejected their suggestion that he's going to travel on Shabbos. Can you imagine? It made them furious. Here, the Frierdicker Rebbe is now rebelling against their direct instruction. And not just rebelling, but making this public statement about observing Shabbos in their prison system. The officials are going to see it, the prisoners are going to see it, could cause a whole revolution. And all of this to reject their scheme to get the Frierdicker Rebbe to break Shabbos. You can imagine how dangerous a position that is. Why does the Frierdicker Rebbe have to put himself in that danger? Especially when you consider the halachic perspective, on the other hand. They wanted him to leave the prison Thursday during the day. At that point, Thursday daytime, the concept of breaking Shabbos is it's not something that is immediate. It's not like you're breaking Shabbos now. Leave the prison now, deal with Shabbos later. And the truth is, whether you'll actually land up breaking Shabbos, we don't know. Many things could change. After they would release the Frierdicker Rebbe from prison, they could have had a whole lot more lobbying, and the Frierdicker Rebbe could have conducted himself in a particular way, as is only that he wouldn't have to leave immediately that night in order to get out of the prison and now say, I'm not going to Kastamar. And even if those few hours between his release and when he was due to leave, they might not have sorted out all the issues. There's whole 24-hour period still until it's Shabbos. Was man man says, given die Möglichkeit, Status Gdoila, sie soll sich abstellen in Mittenweg bis nach Shabbos, and they could have put a tremendous amount of pressure to allow the Frierdicker Rebbe to stay overnight somewhere else on the way to Kastamar just for Shabbos. So why risk his life when there are potentially other ways to deal with this? Und viele gewesen gezwungen bleiben in Bahnwagen bei Shabbos, and even if they forced the Frierdicker Rebbe to stay on the train over Shabbos, There would be something against his will. You're not liable for breaking Shabbos if it's against your will. And the truth is, you're not even breaking a real halacha of Shabbos, meaning to say a Torah law of Shabbos. You're breaking a rabbinic law. It's a tchumin, which is traveling beyond the span that you can travel outside of a city. But if you're sitting on a moving carriage of a train, you're not breaking Shabbos. It's so strange. Why was the Frierdicker Rebbe so clear that he would not travel on Shabbos, travel in a way that could lead to traveling on Shabbos, and rather put himself into immediate, clear and present danger? Surely the responsible thing to do is immediately escape the dangerous situation, i.e. leave the prison, and then work out a plan not to have to travel on Shabbos. This should not come as a surprise, because the overarching attitude of the Frierdicker Rebbe to all of his work and efforts in Russia about Judaism are all on this theme: absolute, super rational dedication to the point of absolute Mesiras Nefesh. It's a topic that the Rebbe has addressed numerous times. The Frierdicker Rebbe did not only put his life on the line for those areas of Judaism that the Torah is clear, it is that you have to give up your life. But even things where a person is entitled to choose whether they're going to risk their life or not, the Frierdicker Rebbe had Mesiras Nefesh. Not only that, but we get Hamol Barucha is a Mesiras Nefesh given euch azelche inyonim was kamek der Chachmei Solam gehalten, as man darf sich nicht Mesiras Nefesh sein. Not only that, the Frierdicker Rebbe risked his life for things that some of the great Torah scholars of the time ruled that you are not supposed to risk your life for. They're not Yehorig Val Yavor. And as the Rebbe points out in the note, that it's like Pinchas, who went ahead and did something that was radical, that even the Chachamim at the time did not approve of. The Frierdicker Rebbe similarly. When you analyze the conduct of the Frierdicker Rebbe in that country, you'll start to understand why the Frierdicker Rebbe behaved this way. When the Frierdicker Rebbe realized the state of the Jewish people in that country, that this is not about an individual and their personal commitment to Judaism. This is about the survival of Jews and Judaism in Russia. To ensure that the candle of the Jewish people is not, God forbid, extinguished. And realizing that his job as the Rebbe, the Nasi of the Jewish people, who has to ensure the survival of the Jewish people, the Frierdicker Rebbe was going all out without any consideration of any limitations or any thought process that might derail the efforts to keep Judaism alive. But that makes sense when you're fighting the regime in order to keep Judaism alive. Here, we're not talking about that. In our situation, here, we're not talking about something that's going to affect the community. Surely this is just a question about the Frierdicker Rebbe's personal conduct in his personal circumstances. Is he going to travel to Kastam or not? Why now is the Frierdicker Rebbe exhibiting this degree of Mesiras Nefesh when it's not on behalf of the community and the survival of Judaism? The whole reason that Frierdicker Rebbe has so much dedication and Mesiras Nefesh is to preserve Judaism. Here, if he endangers himself, Chas v'Shalom, he endangers the entire project, and surely that undermines exactly what he's looking to achieve. The explanation is this. The question over here is not a question about Shabbos. Am I required to risk my life for Shabbos or not? That's not the question. The question on the table here was, am I going to sanctify or, God forbid, desecrate Hashem's name? Why is that? Because the Matorah von Divas Oben arrestiert dem Rebbe is given zu zerstören die Arbeit von Rebbe Bachsokas Hayadus. The whole objective of those who arrested the Rebbe was they wanted to derail his project of keeping Judaism alive, of strengthening Judaism in Russia. Der Rebbe wollte nicht gleich gegengestellt, sich die Pekuda zuvor bald nach seinem Befreien Kirzoinam. Now let's assume that the Frierdicker Rebbe had not immediately responded with an absolute no to their requirement that he should travel out of the prison as the Rebbe soll for Shabbos on Shabbos. But das Faseh given an Nitzachon, there would be a victory on their part. The Rebbe had masking events for Shabbos. We got the Rebbe to agree to travel on Shabbos. Their whole purpose is to undermine Judaism. How amazing is this? We undermine Judaism. We got the Rebbe himself to travel on Shabbos. Die alle Herren von der Askome, want doch nicht gewusst die alle Cheshbonis Hamurim Re'il. Now, anybody who heard what happened, if they had heard that the Frierdicker Rebbe Chas v'Shalom landed up traveling on Shabbos, they wouldn't know all of the details, danger to life, etc. Als wenn es sich mit Stadtwach scheue und wenn es sicher zu Peul sein, als der Rebbe soll nicht darf vor dem Shabbos chulei, nobody's going to know that there are machinations happening behind the scenes to try and intervene to make sure that the Frierdicker Rebbe doesn't actually travel on Shabbos. That's not what people are going to know. They're going to know the Frierdicker Rebbe accepted a process that's going to include travel on Shabbos. As is discussed many times, if the subject matter is sanctifying or desecrating Hashem's name, if it's a matter of Kiddush Hashem or Chilul Hashem, it doesn't matter the scale of the action. Is it very serious or is it something minor? The only consideration is, will people interpret this as a sanctification or chas v'shalom, the opposite? Likewise, it doesn't matter what the details are of whether it's breaking Shabbos truly to be on a train against your will. The fact is, will it sanctify Hashem's name or not? That's the Frierdicker Rebbe's consideration, and therefore there's an issue over here of potential chilul Hashem. Not a chance. He's not even willing to consider it. And that is exactly one of the key messages of Parshas Chukas. Das sagt die Sheiches von Gimmel Tammuz zu Parshas Chukas, which links Gimmel Tammuz to the Parsha. In Parshas Chukas wird es selbst wegen dem Chet von Mei Meriva, was zu dem seine Moshe waren nennisch geworden, als Luis Avias HaKol Hazeh El HaOretz Gomer. Part of what we learn in this Parsha is the story of Moshe hitting, instead of speaking to the rock, which is called Mei Meriva, the rebellious waters, as a result of which Moshe and Aaron are not allowed into Israel. When you look at that story, you think, for that they were barred from Israel? That's such a serious thing. What made this such a serious Aveira? That because of that, Moshe is not allowed into Israel. As the Torah erzählt von Genochin by Moshe and was Moshe zu sein nennisch geworden, especially because the Torah does tell us other things that Moshe did for which he was so-called punished. Von deswegen is a Fazei nicht nennisch geworden mit Azar Harbenoinisch. And none of those things had anything close to this degree of consequence. Und darf get derchet, specifically this, der Schiene zu schlagen der Selle anstatt reden zu ihm. Because instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. That should bring such an outcome that he can't go into Israel. What is so dramatic about it? Now the Tanderuf at ungedeihten Pasuk, the Pasuk clarifies, the problem over here is that you didn't have the, so to speak, faith in me to sanctify my name in front of the Yidden. Aber Rashi is as the far is Rashi points out that's why this issue of hitting the rock was so much more severe than the issue of challenging Hashem to say, where am I supposed to get the meat for all of these people? Says Rashi. When Moshe Rabbeinu said to the Eibishter, how am I supposed to find enough meat for the Yidden? It was a private matter between Hashem and Moshe. Nobody saw it, there's no Chilul Hashem. So the Eibishter let it go. But it's in front of the entire community. The Eibishter wasn't willing to allow it to go because this is an opportunity to sanctify Hashem's name. That now went the other way. Das says in other words, in other words, the parasha is illustrating when the subject we're dealing with is either sanctifying or, God forbid, desecrating Hashem's name. Is neger blois. The only consideration is how will people understand the event? That's why the Frierdicker Rebbe is concerned. Anybody might misinterpret that it's okay to break Shabbos. Not doing it. I'll take it a step deeper. Take it a step deeper. This way that the Frierdicker Rebbe conducted himself, was hat sich gegengestellt die Pekude von die welche haben er steert to to literally oppose the instruction by the people who had arrested him, who technically had power, is given nicht nur was es hat angeht Giloi Azach von Yiddishkeit. That's not only because there was something about Judaism over here that was being potentially undermined. Now, the Rebbe hat erzählt, also weil sie gemacht hat festen Beschluss. But it's more than that. The Frierdicker Rebbe, right at the start of his imprisonment, made a clear resolution, as it's a klal nit nispol verim farzei, that he's not going to allow them to have any effect on him at all. Not only is he going to ignore them when it's issues about Yiddishkeit and about dedication to Hashem, he's not paying them any attention at all across the board. And you know how he suffered for that? Because of that, he suffered physically. They beat him. For what? Not for standing up for Yiddishkeit, for standing up against them on principle across the board. Why? In Azan Hogga is doch nicht scheich die Geschwindigkeit von Kiddush Hashem. Das ist in die Arbeit von Avodas HaTorah. This is now a level deeper even than saying, is this an issue of sanctifying or desecrating Hashem's name? This is even beyond that. You're not even considering if this is Kiddush or Chilul Hashem. Is was der Tam von dem von Anoga von Rebbe? So what prompted the Frierdicker Rebbe to behave this way? Well, that is also alluded to in Parshas Chukas. In fact, in the name Chukas, especially the way that the Alter Rebbe explains the significance of that name. The Alter Rebbe is mevoyer as Chuka is m'shen chakika einkritzen. The Alter Rebbe explains the word Chuka comes from the word to engrave. And the yisn from chakika legabe ksiva, the advantage of engraving over writing is, when you write, the letters that you're writing onto the parchment are an add-on. They're separate to, but now attached to the parchment. The parchment which it's written. Yes, of course. Once you write something onto a parchment, there is now a connection and even a unity between these letters and the klaf. But the reality is it's two separate things, ink and parchment, that have been put together. And that's why it could change and could even be lost altogether. You could erase those letters. Whereas when you engrave something, the letters are in no way independent of the material in which those letters are being carved. The letters are part and parcel of the material where the letters are being inscribed. They're part of the stone, or in the case of the Beis HaMikdash, the precious stones, like the choshen and the shoulder stones that the Kohen Gadol had. So that's precious stones that now contain the letters that represent the names of the Shvatim, or like the luchos. On the far is Omega Chapzatain, the oasis from them Evan, and therefore there is no way to remove the letters from the stone. They're honoring the oasis is honoring them Evan Tov. The only way you could remove the letters is if you remove the letters, you're removing the stone. The same applies spiritually. If a person's Yiddishkeit and the commitment to Hashem is an add-on, it's a layer that they place on themselves. There's me, and there's me serving Hashem. That might not be consistent. There might be times where that layer is very much how I behave, and other times where that layer wears a little bit thin. It's possible that a person could go through a patch where they don't do something that Hashem expects of them for whatever reason, including reasons that are beyond their control. But I'm still me. Sorry, it was a bad patch. I did something I shouldn't have done. I feel terrible about it, but I'm still me. But when Avodas Hashem is something that is carved into my essence, then serving Hashem is not what I do, it's who I am. Then you cannot separate the person and their Avodas Hashem. There's no me who serves. I am a servant. ein Inyan von Avodas, zunehmen von einem Inyan von Avodas Hashem meint zunehmen, zerstören sein Metzias. If somebody were to take from such a person part of their service of Hashem, you may as well rip out part of their body. In exactly the same way as we've mentioned. You want to get rid of those letters that are engraved in the stone, you're going to have to break the stone. So that's a person whose level of dedication to Hashem is, if you want to take away my Yiddishkeit, you're taking away me. Und afar, when you're dealing with a Jew who has their Avodas Hashem engraved into their soul, then they're going to be willing to give up everything, their life included, even their life's work, for any detail of Yiddishkeit, because you cannot separate me from this part of Yiddishkeit, so you may as well take me. And that's how the Frierdicker Rebbe conducted himself. Because Torah mitzvahs for the Frierdicker Rebbe was engraved into his very being. Therefore, his Mesiras Nefesh is not something you have to think about and calculate. Is it appropriate to have Mesiras Nefesh over here? Do I need to have Mesiras Nefesh over here? How much Mesiras Nefesh? It doesn't come into the cheshbon. Why not? See, in dem Fall, ha'haloche, as men, it's in dem Fall, halacha as men darf sich Mesiras Nefesh. I know that it doesn't start a whole analysis. Does halacha require me to have Mesiras Nefesh here? Or maybe the halacha says it depends on the circumstances. It's not that the Frierdicker Rebbe is dedicated to something there, and I'm so dedicated to it that I'll even die for it. But because it's not part of me, I could make a whole cheshbon if I need to sacrifice now or not. It's just automatic, it's natural. In the same way as a person would not allow themselves to be destroyed, the Frierdicker Rebbe cannot allow his Yiddishkeit, even in the tiniest way, to be destroyed. Because serving the Eibishter is part of his reality. To the extent that you cannot separate between the Frierdicker Rebbe, the practitioner, and the Torah itself. It is only normal, natural, and automatic that every single part of Yiddishkeit is with complete dedication to the point of Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore, the Frierdicker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh is not only for things that are obvious in their undermining of his avodah. But rather, the Mesiras Nefesh is, I'm not budging one bit in favor of those who arrested me, because every aspect of this it's the core of my being. So it's not that he made a cheshbon. They're going to try it, and I'm going to show them that they can't. But he's completely dedicated to the Eibishter, so therefore there's no possibility of any form of submission to these villains. If they interfere with his avodah to spread Torah, then he cannot, under any circumstances, allow them any space. Because his avodah is engraved into the core of his soul, it's not a negotiable, it's not even a decision. This is the reality. There is no other reality. And that's why the Frierdicker Rebbe has such a Mesiras Nefesh at every step along the way. And hopefully we can learn a little bit of that to apply in our lives.